rong cho leng so tu da na ku ya hwa ne ka rong shi na ta tao ton chi ne de so ho so cho na nu na ku ya la ning ra da ning ja lu chua ton plau ya te ne shi tom long ton i sa pe ne ge ya da hok ya video ho ka na tho ne shi de la ko ke la ren da ku ti ple ku tu mi ta ra ku ja lu de ko hai tia xin hu na mu cho thai ki ka lu sho hai lu ya lu sho hai lu da ke rong shi ya chi yon da ke ki ku ja lu hai tia tho kan che ku ka yo pa tia ho ku lu khamwa so ka tu do i lang thọ có nọ cụ hu có lông bè giờ cụ hu đó kể lưu thế kể đó hù ta kỳ mù cụ sa kể nhà sinh giờ có lưu xuân tia Shokin whispered as he planted a kiss on Jalia's cheek and drifted off to sleep with her in his arms. The morning dove sung a happy tune as Shokin stirred and found himself alone. He immediately sat up and rushed outside to find Jalia smiling and sitting with Gongchi. The two were conversing as he showed her how to sharpen a dagger. His heart raced at the sight before him, and he walked out to join them. When she looked up at him, he bent down and captured her lips for a kiss, which surprised both her and Gongchi. She placed a hand on his chest and gently pushed him away. The look she gave him was pure innocence of love and hope, making his heart sway. Ya, she asked. Gucci nieta Gucci la ilang jita. Oya kachichakusha, he asked. Gongchi made a face. Ta wamiyo ama. The two men glared at each other and then broke out into a laugh. But the laughter died soon when one of his men at arms came bearing a report. Yelo, tashina katsita to jai patu to. Ladeda mutaho tai kituke. Both him and Gongchi stood up. Gongchi, mumbashada. Oli, he said as he left. He turned to find his wife's broken face and he took her into his arms. She smiled at him, and he wanted to remember this moment. He felt the curve of her body beneath his hands, and he exhaled a breath of fear. Ya Oliga, she whispered. He shut his eyes and whispered, Na ya thơ rau, cô nó cô lúc lỡ thiệt giờ, thơ cô ya sơ kê mô trò. Xin nhé chê rau, cô sơ ya cô chỉ bóng trai, chỉ bóng tsơ. Ta she rau nó, chỉ trong linh chê rau. She pulled away from him. Thơ có tơ lũ đó cô. He cupped her face and looked into her eyes. Cô ya cả cô hali cả chê. Tears filled her eyes and she let out a deep breath. Cô bảo hai tia, za kê mô trao trao, chỉ mô trao lý lưu xế xa. Ta she có tơ lũ hai tia, sơ trong linh chà la. Cô ya chủ trạc á có lỡ tsơ cô. Giờ nhớ, giờ ly, giờ đến bảo lý tư. Con ba ya chủ là trao cô lúc hành dông sơ. He bent down and kissed her deeply. Cô mô cô sa xìa cho đó co. Cô ya cô tí tu, tu thơ tu cơ. Cô sư chỉ bú lăng tư là bố co. Ya chủ ya cô sơ. Con nhớ tỏ cô nắm mơ. Shuaking arrived at the destination where his father was bound to meet King Kietu. The place was bare, no grass in sight, only dirt and a few dried cactuses. He ordered his men to stop, and he got off his horse, feeling off, feeling as if everything was wrong as he looked around the place. The world was silent around him, and he felt the ground beneath him shake. He dropped to his knees and placed a hand on the dirt, feeling it move beneath him. He stood and turned around to find Gongchi and his men behind him. As he looked up, he saw the single arrow that flew from above. He heard Gongchi cry out his name and was shoved by his general, where he toppled over the hill and down the mountain. The arrow missed him by a hair, and he clung onto the broken branch hanging by the mountain top. His sweat rolled down his brows and left a sting in his eye. His body was still healing, and he felt the wound from earlier open. He felt warm blood flow down his arm, and he swung himself to grab onto another branch beside him. Shoking! Gongchi's voice came. He saw his general make his way toward him, and he reached up as Gongchi took his hand and pulled him up. But as they reached each other, he saw the dark emotion that sparked across the other man's eyes. Gongchi, Shuaking said in fear. Ocho, and with that, Gongji shoved him off, and the impact he felt as he hit the bottom of the mountain left him in the dark. Jialia was jerked awake by the loud horse hooves that were around her. She sat up and rushed out of the tent, where she saw half the men at arms return with a bloody Gongji. But the one man she was seeking was nowhere in sight. Her heart sank, and she rushed to where Gongji fell from his horse. She went to help him stand, and he coughed, blood and saliva coming out all at the same time. There was so much blood, and she felt her heart breaking. Gongji, yo li ya, shocking ne? She asked. He looked up with heavily hooded eyes. Gutazi. She shook her head and ripped her hands from him. 个是吵了桃子，要你要多吵，你要注意好多拉海的歌，个还是故意去冷在，可以个啥，说更多了。He broke down and began to cry. Her heart dropped, and she let out a blood-curdling scream and began running toward the direction where Gongji had come from. She screamed his name as the sky above them thundered and rain began falling. Shocking! Cơ tới cho lũ của nà, giờ đến bộ lý tư lò, cơ yo trả cả cho của lũ sinh địa, she cried as she dropped onto the dirt, sobbing. Luo Yin came to help her stand up as Gongxi looked on with a saddening glare. The thunder kept rolling through the afternoon to the evening night, and it sung the same sad tune that Jialia pushed out of her head. She hadn't believed a single word Gongxi said, and as she sat inside the tent holding on to the last tunic her husband wore that still carried his scent, she let her tears fall, staining the fabric in her hands. No, it's not true. He would be coming back. She had to believe in this, because as his wife, if she didn't believe in him, who would? The flap to her tent opened, and Gongji walked in with a tray of food. He set it aside and came to sit beside her. His face was healing from his wounds, and she knew he must have felt worse than she did. He said. He looked up with tearful eyes. She laughed and said, "Cô sai tia, cô tức ổn được tút xí tông tên bộ lên nó. Cô yếu chính chân dùng nhiệm bộ lên có ya. Sure kinh sa sure chỉ tu dùng nhiệm bộ có. Cô khé có. Cô ý chính chân. Cho nên người sẽ phải trong nơi chỉ sao vài tia, là yếu tao trong kia. Nếu như chỉ chê, nếu như chỉ tua." He crossed his arms. Cô hãy cho các bỏ hệ đến kia. She shot to her feet. Cô hãy cho các sa tia còn nữa tua. Má của lúc sẽ chắc con á, he cried. Lý do của tôi bây giờ trong chắp là số lần số tụ nhau không thể tế nọ. Khỏi trong khỏi phải ư tư tàu again tàu chắc có. Có lúc cũng mua có khỏi trong là khỏi chúa. She slapped him across the face. Cơn gió có khỏi thơ nó mơ. Nhau hồ của lúc nên sửa cơn tí lần tí tù. Thế lý do tụ xin nên của sai. Cú xin chân hai tiền nữa tôi không yên bảo lên tờ. Có giờ hai lý trả là có hay có. Để she của yên thiệt cái tàu nữa lúc chế. Nếu thư của bỏ nữa lúc chế kia tờ của lúc khó mua. Của mà lên chân. She lên tờ chế lúc ba lúc chúa sức chỉ mua nương gầy được của. She turned to go, and Gongji shouted out her name. He came to stand before her. Có ai thứ bao nhiêu sự? Có ai ở nhà cái thứ liền thiệt tao nữa. Ta xin nó sửa cái gì hơn tụi yên vô lo chắp lờ. Chị cũng đâu có mù. Chị ở lưng một thiệt cái tao nữa. Chị cũng mà bá có. Jialia watched as Gongji's face remained still, and she slowly nodded her head. Oli, có ai thứ bao nhiêu rồi? Chị chỉ nhớ của chị đó có. Có bỏ cho kẻ yêu mù. Cô sai tiệt thay kỳ. Sơn gió một chỗ tại chế tù. Muốn thiệt kế công tên đã nữa. Cô chế xế là tiệt nếu chụp bá sư vì hai tiệt số kinh nhân ý thứ tú. Oli. Jialia gave him a weak smile and turned to leave the tent. Once outside in the air, she dropped to her knees and began sobbing. She would have to be strong now. She needed the strength to find him. Without a body to prove that the ambush killed him, she wouldn't believe it. Her husband was a strong, proud warrior who carried a reputation of steel in the battlefields. She would never believe once that he would be that easy to get rid of. She stood up, wiped her cheeks, and took a deep breath. Shocking. Có chỉ son trai. Cú cho lô hạt địa của những thiệt cái tàu có. Cú chỉ bu có chân nhiên gì lại. Cú giờ có ba cú giờ có xe. Có luôn bè cú giờ tụ tụ cú đi. Cú những thiệt cái tàu có sơ sơ. The night crickets began playing their nightly song as Shocking woke and felt his hands and feet begin to tingle. He sat up and found himself in a tent where there were red sheets with blue stars. He recognized those immediately, and just as he thought, his uncle entered bearing a fresh basin of water. He felt the betrayal hit him hard, and he managed to stand slowly. Shocking. Mitu, kasanchai. Shimpaluti yo oligaruka, his uncle said. Dalo, no. King Ketu smiled and dipped a towel in the basin, squeezed the water out, and gestured for Shocking to sit. He did as told, and his uncle began to wash the wound on his arm. Shaya monachi kutelin tiatoka. Tejo vi ko ni hapatia kusaketia. Kacheng, kuyoke, kupongpe. Tashi uja ko halapo ka tuneng. Ku thao khá là bỏ có bự bể cứ hà. Khay ku sha. Yo li jatia. The pain made him shut his eyes, and Gongji's last words hit his chest so hard that he jerked. His uncle stepped back, and he recollected his emotions. Dalo, cho nên dần xia được cúi chuẩn chỉ của luôn đi sư tê lý ta. Hà lý nó cho có bao. Cũng chân tao hai tia Gongji tí lăng sư đi nhưng chịu mua bằng sự của lý nó được cú. Dù chịu mua ít tung đó nữa ok nếu lúc ra tê lý lòng bỏ lý nó. Cú kéo tố cho cũng chân tao tia đi nhưng mua tố tà lợ chơi từ bùa cái trong sai sư. Ta xin nó. Giờ lũ tốt cho con này kì, có khai hạt để của tôi là. Khó nói thế lý giờ khó, giờ bá tàu cũng chế lúc họ bỏ. Cú ô lý là tao. Ê giờ có bao có sấy tốt cho là, có giờ có cú hai tí dạng gạo là. Shua King shut his eyes and a single tear fell down his cheek. Hai chân nên trái lìa. Cú mà sấy sẽ trong lý cả. The sun had dried up last night's angry rain as Gongji and Jialia rode together on two horses with a few men-at-arms behind them. She had never been farther out than this army bracket, and the view was breathtaking. She inhaled a breath and wondered how beautiful it would have been if only Shouking was here with her. The sun was high now, and it was shining down, making her feel faint. She groaned and leaned forward, almost falling off her horse, when Gongji caught the reins. Nhậu đi cả? He asked. Jean-Li Guya Chou Mua, she whispered. He got off his horse and reached over to help her get down. He steadied her when she reached the ground, but didn't let her go. She pulled away, and he pulled his hands back. She reached for the horse to keep her balance, and the animal frightened, riding off, and it left her falling forward. Gongji caught her and steadied her as he whistled, and the horse came to an abrupt stop. Kaboja, he asked gently. Julia. She tried to remove herself from him, and he didn't let go. Gongji, Takachaku. He finally released his hold, and she stepped away from him, not trusting the look in his eyes. La Peshandana, Gongji said to the men at arms. She gathered herself and walked to sit down at a nearby log, where she took in a deep breath. She watched as Gongji came to sit beside her, and removed some bread for her. She took it, and when she took a bite, he suddenly reached over and brushed the crumb from her lips. She moved away, and he took her in his arms. Con trai của he asked. Cho của nà, cậu ở đây chỉ lý có. Cô yêu số kinh tụ bao nhiêu nà, ôi giá có chỉ bảo chạy lì. Cô là bá cả sân nà. Cô chân tàu tìa số kinh như chỉ xá lý cả. She laughed and put some distance between them. Có vừa bỏ. Có chỉ bảo số kinh rong ở giá có xá lý có nà. So ya nhỏ hồn nữ nên, ya ya không tới ya nữ tu lợ. Lữ tu nên ý cứu chứ tạo. Có giá cả đến được cô. Cô yêu số kinh tí lên tí tu sơ. Nữ tu tu là nà. Có chẳng yêu chính chân của thế lọ. Trên có. Cho lý có cho có lưng từ yêu trên có nà. Trên chẳng yêu có món được bỏ chơi sư bỏ. Ta xin nào mua ở tu nên cũng trên. Ý chỉ yêu số kinh, ở chỉ yêu của tu kinh sơ. She turned and began walking away. The anger that was building up in her heart and her soul was tearing her apart. And she wanted to hit something, to damage something so it would hurt as much as she did. Tears filled her eyes, and she managed to make it down the hill before she realized she'd lost her way. She turned around and looked behind her at a ghastly mountain top and grabbed a road. How did she manage to come here? She started to round her way back when she heard a twig snap behind her. She stopped and turned around, her eyes gazing at the silence before her. It was deathly quiet as she began backing up, And when she turned, someone wrapped their arm around her and clamped a hand over her mouth. She moaned silently as she was picked up and brought into the deeper part of the forest. When she turned around, she stared into the face of none other than her husband. Her heart lit up with happiness as she threw her arms around him. Tears spilled, and she gasped for breath as his arms held her. Shocking, she whispered. She pulled away and saw that his eyes held tears and hurt. She ran her fingers over his cheeks, and he took her hand, leaning into her touch. He looked up and a tear dropped. He smiled. Rong, Kia cũng chỉ cho có một số tại kia tù. Thầu có tốt sao bé có yếu bó cả chân. Giờ ô lý chả là có chỉ số khen lưng từ sao cụ. Cụ chỉnh chỉ tàu của tù khen, thầu cụ nó có tổ của lưng bên thao kế rộng. Cụ thế đi là chua cả tàu có sư. Cho lù ra cụ. Rồi cụ ra hồn đó xưa, kia cụ lúc số lù nà, chờ có sư mà. Cụ giờ sáng rộng có có một sao chờ. Có chỉ sáng rồi mà cụ tù mi ta ra. Cụ tù cho lù ra có. Dần tay bỏ tư, nhô bỏ tư. Cụ giờ chủ trò lò đó có lúc xưng tiệt. He kissed her, and his hands raked into her hair, destroying her bun. She wrapped her arms around him and cried gently as he whispered sweet words. Gongchi looked up as she made her way back with a handful of ripe berries. She looked happy, and it made him wonder what she had encountered. She had been gone a long time, and he sat up realizing the worst. But as soon as she saw him, the light in her eyes died, and she became the same expressionless woman she had been in the past few days. She came to sit a few feet from him and began to eat the berries. He watched her, noticing how smooth her skin was. She was so beautiful. He had touched her hands a few times, and the smoothness made him ache in places he thought had died. She was the reason behind his betrayal. He was promised that if he could make Shokin disappear off the face of the earth, it was all he could do to agree. And the more he looked at her, the more he wanted her. He asked. She looked up. Oh, tia của chị sắp lá. Cụ mù tới tao kéo cha cụ bà cho xi măng đồng nào ở đây cũng cho sơ sơ keng. Rồi lại cụ mua qua tới chỉ tao téo cha chạy kia đi trồng tu lợ. Cụ bóng phệ, tia chỉ tao kéo cụ thấy lấy lò li. She sat up. Cơ bọn nó mò, cụ tung ba tới dần chỗ thế. Cụ chỉ cụ nó cho gì nó xứ trâu plá lợ. She continued to eat the berries, and he took a cloak from his bag and walked to put it around her. She flinched and removed it. She handed it back to him, and he watched as she removed a cloak he recognized as Shokeng's from her bag, and she put it around her shoulders. Cô nâng có ấy lò bà tàu, he asked. Tao má? Cơ lũ Shokeng bảo tư. She stopped chewing and paused, and then she connected her gaze to him, and tears welled up in her eyes. Cơ sạp bảo lo? Yeah, cô sạp bảo. Jialia held the cloak together in her hands. Cô sao kê lũ được Shokeng? Luôn tôi như nó, luôn tên như bỏ. Hiện sự kiện sự tàu, cha nhung dậu sự chưa? Chúng mơ cụ thế nữ ư ở tu, ở lưu xe thế lý sư hậu. Ta nữ kể luôn tu đánh chúng mơ lửa tu. This made him feel an ache of jealousy, and he looked away for a second, and then he replied, Cơ bà lũ tàu lũ tu lợ. Cụ cho tì sở kênh luôn bè một ta cụ tên đăng sư. Lũ tu chính đăng luôn bè, cụ như xin trở. Ủa trời ơi, nè sẽ lời chuyện nó cộng tông plau rồi ra đến hình cho lùi chúa. Tuần trí giữa tự sẽ sai tận tay nó. Và tới cái xí ở đến nét số lần sẽ tự nhiên trí kể nó cá nhân rộng. Bé mà linh sinh trí rồi.